Lady Cecily Montfort tore a servant's dress before 80 guests. She meant to expose a clumsy maid. Instead, the candlelight fell upon a white, three-pronged scar, and the future Duchess whispered the name of a girl who had been dead for 18 years. Rosamund. It was a story of a stolen name, a proud man's costly silence, and a woman who had served in the house that was preparing to purchase its future with her inheritance. The claret smelled sharp and sour upon the Axminster carpet. Margaret Bell felt it soaking through the knees of her grey wool dress as she gathered the broken pieces of a crystal goblet. Heat from 6 dozen candles pressed against her face. Yet the December cold still clung to the stone beneath the carpet. Around her, the Duke of Calderwick's guests had fallen into the particular hush of people who expected cruelty and did not wish to miss it. Lady Cecily stood above her in ivory silk, one gloved hand stained red at the fingertips. "You struck my arm," she said. Margaret kept her eyes lowered. "No, my lady. The train of your gown caught the edge of my tray." It was the truth. Margaret had spent 9 years in service and could cross a crowded room carrying 12 filled glasses without making the stems sing. But truth had little weight in a ballroom where one woman wore seed pearls and the other wore a white apron. Cecily's pale eyebrows rose. "Are you correcting me?" At the far end of the room, the musicians held their bows above the strings. The Duke of Calderwick had left his conversation beside the marble fireplace and was moving toward them. Nathaniel Harcourt was a tall man of 34, severe in black evening clothes, with a face that looked as though it had been taught restraint before it had learned pleasure. He did not hurry. Dukes were not expected to hurry, even toward disaster. Margaret placed the last shard upon the silver tray. "I beg your pardon for the accident, my lady." "An accident." Cecily gave a small laugh. "You have watched his grace all evening. Perhaps you hope to make yourself memorable." A few guests looked away. Others did not. Margaret rose carefully. Her wet apron dragged against her skirt. "I was watching the room. It is my duty." "Your duty is obedience." Cecily caught the top of Margaret's dress near the shoulder. Margaret stepped back, more from shock than fear. The seam had already been weakened by years of laundering. It split with a sound as soft as paper tearing. The grey wool opened from the collar to the upper sleeve. Margaret seized the fabric before it could fall farther, but the damage had been done. Her right shoulder was bare beneath the blaze of the chandeliers. Across the skin ran a white scar shaped like 3 narrow branches meeting at one point. The mark began beneath her collarbone and disappeared under the torn edge of her chemise. Cecily stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so completely that even her lips seemed made of wax. Her fingers remained knotted in the torn cloth, but the triumph had vanished from them. "Rosamund," she breathed. Margaret heard it. So did the Duke. Nathaniel removed his black evening coat and placed it around Margaret's shoulders. The wool carried the clean scent of cedar and cold air. His jaw tightened as he faced his fiancée. "That is enough, Lady Cecily." It was not enough. Margaret knew it before the words had finished leaving his mouth. Enough would have been an apology demanded before every person who had watched. Enough would have been Cecily removed from the ballroom instead of the servant she had exposed. Enough would have required the Duke to choose justice, while justice still carried a price. Instead, Nathaniel turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Fenwick, take Miss Bell downstairs and see that she is attended." Margaret lifted her chin. For one dangerous second her eyes met his. His expression held anger, but not courage. "Yes, your grace," she said. She crossed the ballroom beneath 80 silent gazes, wearing the Duke's coat over her torn uniform. No one resumed dancing until the green baize door had closed behind her. She did not weep, not there, in the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Fenwick fastened the door and drew the curtains, although there was only darkness beyond them. She was a broad, silver-haired woman who had ruled Hartmere House for 27 years, with a ring of keys at her waist and a memory more reliable than any account book. "Let me see," she said. Margaret released the torn fabric. Mrs. Fenwick examined the red marks where Cecily's nails had caught the skin, then looked at the old scar. She knew it. Margaret's hands went still. Mrs. Fenwick had not asked a question. "She called me Rosamund. I heard. Who is Rosamund?" The housekeeper looked toward the door. Music had begun again above them, muffled by floors and distance. The dance continued because great houses had always possessed the ability to swallow a woman's humiliation and serve supper afterward. "What did your mother tell you of your birth?" Mrs. Fenwick asked. "Ada Bell was my mother in every way that mattered. That was not what I asked." Margaret pulled the Duke's coat tighter around herself. "She said my father was a clerk who died of fever. She said I was 6 when illness took my memory. I remember a room with blue walls, a woman sing and smoke. Nothing more." Mrs. Fenwick opened a cupboard and brought out a clean shawl. "Ada Bell came to Hartmere once, long before you entered service. It was the summer of 1868. She asked to speak to the late Duchess and would tell no one why. The Duchess had already gone to London. Ada left before sunset and never returned." "You knew her?" "Only by sight. I knew she was frightened." The name Rosamund moved through Margaret's thoughts like a draught beneath a locked door. Somewhere beyond it lay the blue room, the song, and the smell of smoke. A knock sounded. Mrs. Fenwick opened the door only a hand's breadth. Lady Cecily's maid stood outside with a folded sheet of paper. "For Miss Bell." The note contained one sentence: "You will leave Hartmere before the household rises." It bore Cecily's initials, but the order beneath them carried the Duke's authority, whether he knew of it or not. By sunrise Margaret would have no position, no character, and no reference. A maid dismissed for insolence could knock at 50 doors and find all of them closed. Mrs. Fenwick read the note and crushed it in her fist. "His Grace will hear of this." He heard enough upstairs. Margaret's voice remained quiet, but Mrs. Fenwick looked at her as though a plate had shattered between them. The Duke's coat lay heavily upon Margaret's shoulders. She folded it with care and placed it on the desk. "Please return that to him." "What will you do?" Margaret thought of the small attic room she shared with a sewing maid, of 3 dresses, 2 pairs of stockings, and £11 saved over 9 years. Then she remembered the scar reflected in Cecily's terrified eyes. "Before I go," she said, "I shall learn why a marquis's daughter knows the name of my dead woman." But the inevitable morning never came in the manner Cecily had planned. At 2:30, while the guests drank champagne in the supper-room, Margaret climbed the narrow servants' stairs to the attic. Frost silvered the inside of the small window. Her roommate slept with the blankets pulled over her head. Exhausted after carrying coal scuttles since dawn, Margaret drew her trunk from beneath the bed. Ada Bell had died the previous spring in a cottage outside Leeds. She had left no jewelry, no money beyond the burial expenses, and no explanation for the dreams that had woken Margaret since childhood. Her possessions filled less than half the trunk: a black shawl, a horn comb, a worn prayer book, and a wooden sewing box that still smelled faintly of lavender. Margaret lifted the prayer book. Its leather cover was cracked at the spine. She had opened it 100 times since Ada's death, but now she noticed that the rear lining sat higher than the front. She slid a hairpin beneath the paper. The paste gave way. A small brass key fell into her palm, followed by an envelope yellowed at the edges. Her name was written across it in Ada's uneven hand: Margaret. "If anyone ever calls you Rosamund, read this, and trust no person bearing the name Montfort." The room seemed to tilt. She sat on the floorboards and forced herself to continue. "I should have told you before, but fear becomes a habit as surely as silence does. You were not born Margaret Bell. I took you from Rowanmere Lodge on the night of the fire, When you were 6 years old, you had a wound upon your right shoulder from the broken nursery grate. Dr. Lane stitched it in 3 lines. He said the mark would remain. Your name is Lady Rosamund Ellery. Your mother was Helena, Countess of Ellery. Your father was Edmund, the 8th Earl. Both were dead before the fire. Lord Dunridge was made your guardian. He told the world you had perished. You did not. Margaret stopped. Below the attic, a door closed. Footsteps entered the servants' passage. She folded the letter, but her hands had begun to shake. The final lines were stained, as though water had once fallen upon the page. The key belongs to a dead box held by Mr. Silas Redfern, solicitor, Stonegate, York. He will require proof. Tell him Ada Bell kept her promise. Tell him the child remembered the blue room. Forgive me for giving you a safe life instead of your true one. I did not know how to give you both. The footsteps stopped outside the attic. Margaret pushed the key into the hem of her petticoat and slipped the letter beneath her bodice. The door opened without a knock. Mr. Pike, the Duke's under-butler, entered with 2 footmen. His face wore the solemn satisfaction of a man permitted to be cruel on someone else's instructions. Lady Cecily's sapphire brooch is missing, he said. Your trunk is to be searched. Margaret rose. On whose authority? Do you require the future Duchess of Calderwick to explain herself to you? I require you to say whether His Grace gave the order. Pike's mouth hardened. Stand aside. The footman emptied her trunk upon the floor. The prayer book struck the boards. Ada's shawl was shaken, her stockings unrolled, and the lining of the sewing box pried loose. Margaret watched every movement. Cecily had recognized the scar, ordered her away, and now wanted something found or planted. One of the footmen reached for the pocket of Margaret's work apron. "Stop," she said. Pike smiled. "There it is." The footman drew out a velvet case. Margaret had never seen it before. Inside lay a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Blue as the room she remembered in dreams. Pike closed the case with a snap. "The constable will be sent for." "No," said a voice from the doorway. Nathaniel stood in the passage without his coat, his white shirt stark beneath his evening waistcoat. He looked first at the brooch, then at the possessions scattered across the floor. Pike bowed. "Your Grace." Lady Cecily reported. "I know what Lady Cecily reported. I also know that Miss Bell has served in this house for 4 years without a spoon going missing. The brooch was in her apron, an apron she left in the housekeeper's room when her dress was torn." Silence pressed against the rafters. Nathaniel held out his hand. Pike surrendered the case. "Who touched this before it was found?" Neither footman answered. "You will all leave." Pike flushed. "Your Grace, the reputation of the household is presently being damaged by your refusal to obey me." The men withdrew. Nathaniel waited until their steps had disappeared, then placed the brooch on the washstand as though it were something unclean. Margaret knelt to gather Ada's belongings. "Leave those," he said. "Someone else will restore the room. Someone else has already searched it." He bent to pick up the prayer book. Margaret took it from him before he could notice the loosened lining. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition of her fear. "Who is Rosamund?" she asked. The question struck him more deeply than she expected. Nathaniel shut the attic door. Lady Rosamund Ellery was the daughter of the Earl of Ellery. She died in a fire at Rowanmere Lodge in 1867. How old was she? 6, and Lord Dunridge, her maternal uncle and legal guardian, Lady Cecily's father. Margaret pressed the prayer book against her ribs. "What happened to Lady Rosamund's property?" He studied her face. "Why do you ask?" "Because your fiancée looked at my scar and called me by her name." Nathaniel's gaze moved toward the torn shoulder of her dress. He turned away at once, granting the modesty his fiancée had taken. Lady Rosamund inherited Rosewick Manor and a large industrial trust from her mother, he said. After her death, the income passed under the settlement to Lord Dunridge's management. A portion of that property forms Lady Cecily's marriage settlement. There it was, the future of Hertford House, the Duke's debts, Cecily's pearls, and the marriage planned for 6 weeks hence. All of it rested upon the grave of a child whose scar Margaret carried. She rose slowly. "My dismissal," she said. "Did you order it?" "No. Will you prevent it?" His answer took 1 second too long. "Until this matter is understood, it may be safer for you to leave Hertford." "Safer for whom? Miss Bell? You placed a coat around me before 80 people and sent me below stairs. Now a jewel has been put in my apron, and you propose to send me away quietly. Your Grace, I have spent my life learning the difference between kindness and justice. Kindness is what powerful people offer when justice would inconvenience them." Nathaniel's face changed, but she had no wish to soften the blow. "Lady Cecily's fortune is expected to rescue this estate," she continued. "If I am who she fears I am, then you are not marrying money. You are marrying the woman who helped steal it. You are making a grave accusation." "No, I am asking a grave question." The music below changed to a waltz. Nathaniel looked toward the window. Dawn was still hours away, yet frost had made the glass pale. "What do you intend to do?" Margaret tucked Ada's prayer book into the trunk. "Go to York." He saw the answer in her face before she spoke the rest. "And this time, Your Grace, I shall not wait for your permission." By 7 o'clock, Hertford's guests were asleep, and Margaret was walking toward the village station with her trunk strapped behind a hired cart. Mrs. Fenwick had given her bread, a wool blanket, and a written character bearing the housekeeper's own name. "His Grace ordered a carriage," Mrs. Fenwick said as they stood beneath the bare branches at the end of the drive. "I declined it. He also ordered Pike confined to his room until he can be questioned." Margaret adjusted her gloves. One thumb had been darned twice. "That is something. Not enough? Not yet." Mrs. Fenwick embraced her with unusual fierceness. "Ada once trusted this house. I believe she hoped the late Duchess would help her. I failed to understand what stood before me then. I will not fail twice." The cart rolled down the frozen lane. Hertford House receded behind the trees, its windows reflecting the gray morning. Margaret had entered it at 21 through the servant's door. She left at 25 without knowing which name belonged to her. At the station, coal smoke hung beneath the iron canopy. Porters shouted over the hiss of steam. Third-class passengers waited on wooden benches, holding bundles and tin boxes close to their feet. A maid's annual wages could vanish in a handful of railway journeys. Margaret bought 1 ticket to York and counted the coins remaining in her purse. As she approached the platform, a constable stepped in front of her. "Margaret Bell?" Her hand closed around the brass key hidden in her glove. "Yes, you are required to return to Hertford House. A second item has been reported missing." Behind him stood Lord Dunridge. He had arrived before sunrise in a private railway carriage, though no invitation had summoned him. Malcolm Montfort, Marquess of Dunridge, was a handsome man gone heavy with age, his silver beard cut close, and his eyes as pale as his daughter's. He looked at Margaret's face for a long moment. Then he looked at her right shoulder. "There has been a misunderstanding," he told the constable. "Miss Bell is not a thief. She is unwell." Margaret felt more frightened by his gentleness than she had by the threat of arrest. "I am perfectly well, my lord. My daughter tells me you have suffered delusions concerning a dead child. Your daughter told you very quickly." His smile remained. "Come back to the house. We shall arrange a generous pension and a position somewhere quiet." "How generous?" He blinked. "Generous enough to purchase my silence," she said, "or generous enough to purchase yours." The constable shifted awkwardly. Lord Dunridge's smile disappeared. A train whistle split the air. Margaret moved toward the third-class carriage. Dunridge caught her wrist. Ada Bell should have understood when to let the dead remain buried. The words were low, meant only for her. Margaret stared at his gloved hand until he released her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For proving she told the truth." She boarded as the guard called for the doors. Dunridge remained on the platform, his face shrinking behind steam and dirty glass. Only when the train began to move did Margaret discover the folded card he had pressed into her palm. On one side was the address of a private asylum outside Wakefield. On the other, in his own hand, he had written, "Women without names are easily given new ones." Margaret tore the card in half. But she kept both pieces. Evidence she was beginning to understand could wear the face of a threat. Stonegate was slick with afternoon rain when Margaret found the solicitor's office above a bookseller. The brass plate beside the door had darkened almost black. "Silas Redfern, Solicitor and Commissioner for Oaths." The clerk at the front desk looked at her plain coat and travel-stained hem. "Mr. Redfern does not receive applicants for domestic positions. I have not come for a position." Margaret placed the brass key on his blotter. "Tell him Ada Bell kept her promise." The clerk's irritation vanished. Within minutes, Margaret was standing in a narrow room lined with deed boxes. Silas Redfern was nearly 70, with clouded spectacles and ink upon the side of his hand. He locked the door after her. "Your face," he said. "What of it?" He opened a drawer and removed a miniature portrait in an oval ivory frame. The woman painted there had chestnut hair, gray-green eyes, and a small cleft in her chin. Margaret touched her own chin. "Helena Ellery," Redfern said, "your mother." The word entered the room and found no place to settle. Margaret had loved Ada Bell. She would not diminish that love to make space for a dead countess. Yet the painted woman's eyes stirred something older than memory. Blue walls, firelight, a melody with no words. Redfern took the key and led her to a cabinet. It opened a black deed box marked R.E. 1859. Inside lay a certified baptism entry, a packet of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, a copy of Helena Ellery's marriage settlement, and a sealed affidavit bearing Ada Bell's name. Margaret exhaled. "Is this enough?" "Enough to begin. Not enough to prevail," he explained with the blunt patience of a man who had watched truth lose to money before. Lady Rosamund's body had never been positively identified after the Rowanmere fire, but a coroner had accepted that the remains found in the nursery were hers. Lord Dunridge had then obtained an order allowing him to administer the trust. For 18 years he had controlled its income. A living claimant would have to prove identity before the trustees and, if challenged, before the High Court's Chancery Division. "The scar?" Margaret asked. "Doctor." Ezra Lane recorded treating it 3 months before the fire. "A nursery grate collapsed while you were playing. He used silver wire for the deepest closure and made a drawing because the wound was unusual. If he lives, his testimony would be powerful." "Where is he?" "Scarborough, when last I heard." Redfern lifted Ada's affidavit. "This states that she carried you from the house after discovering a man pouring lamp oil across the nursery landing. She believed the fire was meant to kill you. She fled when one of Dunridge's men followed her to the station. Why did she hide me for 18 years? Because the first person she approached for help was found drowned in the ooze 3 days later." Rain tapped at the window. Margaret thought of Ada checking every lock twice, Ada refusing to be photographed, Ada changing lodgings whenever a stranger asked questions. Fear becomes a habit as surely as silence does. "Who died in the nursery?" Margaret asked. Redfern's mouth tightened. "No one knows. The remains were too badly burned." A child's silver bracelet was found beside them. He opened a smaller envelope. Inside was a charcoal rubbing of that bracelet's clasp. The crest belonged to the Montfort family. "Cecily," Margaret whispered. "Lady Cecily was at Rowanmere that night. She was 11. Her father claimed she had been taken home before the fire. No servant could confirm it. The office clock marked 4. Redfern looked toward the sound as though it had reminded him of danger. You must stay somewhere unknown to the Montforts. We shall send a telegram to Dr. Lane and petition the trustees. Until then, tell no one where you are. Lord Dunridge saw me board the train." Redfern was silent, then the front door below slammed open. Heavy steps climbed the stairs. The clerk protested. A man answered in the clipped voice of authority. Redfern swept the papers back into the box. "There is another stair through the copying room. I am tired of back stairs." Lady Rosamund. "Margaret," she said, "until the other name is proved." The handle turned. Nathaniel entered alone, rain shining on the shoulders of his coat. Margaret's relief angered her. "How did you find me?" Mrs. Fenwick remembered the name Redfern from a card Ada carried years ago. He looked at the open deed box. "And Dunridge left Hartmere so quickly that I decided to follow the direction he feared." Redfern shut the door. "Does Lady Cecily know you are here?" "She knows I have postponed the signing of our marriage settlement." For the first time since the ballroom, Margaret saw the Duke without certainty. He had chosen an action that could cost him Hartmere, his seat in the Lords, and the future he had arranged. The choice had not transformed him into a hero. It had merely brought him to the threshold where decency began. Nathaniel removed a folded paper from his pocket. This was found in Pike's room. It was a bank draft for £200, payable to the under-butler and signed by Lord Dunridge. "For placing the brooch?" Margaret asked. Pike confessed. "He says Lady Cecily gave the order. Dunridge supplied the money. Will you dismiss him?" "Pike has been dismissed. His confession has been sworn before a magistrate. And Lady Cecily?" Nathaniel met her gaze. "The engagement is not yet ended." Margaret closed the deed box. There it was again. Courage delayed until the cost could be calculated, but before she could answer, the clerk called from the outer room. "Mr. Redfern, a telegram from Scarborough." Redfern tore open the envelope. His eyes moved across the narrow strip of paper. "Dr. Lane is alive," he said. "He remembers the child and the scar." Nathaniel took a breath. Redfern had not finished. "Lord Dunridge's men reached him this morning. His rooms have been searched, and the medical book containing his drawing is gone." The scar had opened the grave. Now someone meant to bury the proof. Dr. Lane lived above the surgery he had surrendered to his son, in rooms that faced the grey North Sea. By the time Margaret, Redfern, and Nathaniel reached Scarborough the following evening, sleet had hardened along the railings, and the wind carried salt through every seam of Margaret's coat. The old physician received them beside a coal fire. He was thin enough to seem folded inside his chair, but his eyes remained clear. "Come nearer," he told Margaret. She did. He looked at her face for only a moment. Helena's eyes, Edmund's stubborn mouth. Margaret did not know whether to smile or recoil from a stranger who could name pieces of her. Dr. Lane pointed to the chair opposite him. Mrs. Lane, a gentle woman with white curls, remained in the room while Margaret loosened the shoulder of her dress. The physician did not touch the scar. He studied it through a magnifying lens, following the three pale branches and the tiny round marks left where silver wire had once entered the skin. "There were 7 sutures," he said. 3 along the upper branch, 2 along each of the others. The grate had a broken ornament in the shape of a hawthorn leaf. It tore downward when the child fell. Margaret looked at Mrs. Lane. The older woman counted silently and nodded. "Could another wound leave the same mark?" Nathaniel asked. "Another wound might imitate its shape. It would not imitate the small depression beneath the middle branch." Dr. Lane turned to Margaret. "Your collarbone was cracked. I said it poorly because the household would not permit me to take you to the infirmary. The bone healed with a ridge. It is still there." Margaret pressed 2 fingers beneath the scar. She had felt that ridge all her life. "Why would they not permit the infirmary?" she asked. Lord Dunridge said gossip concerning an injured heiress might lower confidence in the trust. He had become your guardian only weeks before. Lane's mouth tightened. I was younger, and I mistook obedience for prudence." Nathaniel looked down. Margaret saw that the words had found their second mark. "Lady Cecily was present when you were hurt," the physician continued. "She held the basin while I cleaned the wound. You cried for your mother. Cecily told you that dead mothers did not answer." The room blurred at the edges. A child's voice returned through 18 years of darkness. "Stop crying, Rose. Dead mothers do not answer." Margaret gripped the arms of the chair. She knew me. She could not have mistaken the scar. Redfern opened his case. "Will you swear to this before the Ellery trustees?" "I shall swear before any court in England." "And your medical book?" Dr. Lane glanced toward the broken cabinet beside the door. "Taken. But physicians are vain creatures, Mr. Redfern. We publish unusual cases when we believe they make us look clever." He asked his wife to bring a bound volume from the shelf. Inside was an issue of the British Medical Journal dated March 1867. A short account described the treatment of a branching wound and fractured clavicle in R.E., female child, aged 6. It did not name Rosamund, but it contained the same drawing that had been cut from Lane's stolen notes. "I sent it to the editor before the fire," he said. "Lord Dunridge cannot steal every copy." For the first time Redfern smiled. The smile lasted less than a minute. A stone struck the window. Glass burst inward. Nathaniel pulled Margaret from the chair as a second stone rolled across the carpet, wrapped in paper. Footsteps ran below, swallowed by the wind before anyone reached the street. Redfern unfolded the paper. "Withdraw the claim before Thursday, or Ada Bell's fate will be envied." Thursday was the day Nathaniel's marriage settlement was to be signed. The physician's evidence had not frightened Lord Dunridge into retreat. It had frightened him into haste. That night Margaret stood at the window of a small room in the Grand Hotel and watched lamps move along the harbor. Nathaniel had arranged adjoining rooms for Redfern and himself, then posted a hotel porter outside her door. She had objected until Redfern pointed out that refusing sensible protection merely because a duke offered it would still allow pride to make her decisions. A knock came at 11:30. "Who is it?" "Calderwick." Margaret opened the door but did not invite him inside. Nathaniel held the torn pieces of Dunridge's card from the station. "These fell from your coat at Dr. Lane's." She took them. "Thank you." He remained in the corridor. "I owe you an apology." "Several. Then I should begin with the first." He rested one hand against the door frame, not to block her, but as though he required support for words he had not practiced. "In the ballroom, I knew Cecily had committed an outrage. I stopped her hand, but I protected the evening, the guests, the engagement. I allowed you to bear the shame because confronting her publicly would have damaged the future I had arranged." Margaret waited. "When you asked whether I would prevent your dismissal, I considered my debts before your danger. You saw that calculation in me, and you named it correctly." The harbor bell sounded beyond the glass. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because an apology that asks to be rewarded is another kind of purchase." His eyes held hers. "You owe me neither forgiveness nor affection. I wanted only to say the truth without charging you for it." She had known men who apologized with flowers, coins, promises, or excuses. She had never heard one strip the apology of every demand. "What will you do on Thursday?" she asked. "Refuse to sign." "If I am proved to be Margaret Bell, refuse still. Hartmere's principal debt comes due in March. I shall sell the London house, close the south wing, and lease 2,000 acres. My grandfather built his comfort upon borrowed money. I will not build mine upon yours." The answer loosened something in her chest, but she would not mistake relief for trust. Trust was slower work. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Bell." She closed the door gently. At breakfast, a telegram waited from Mrs. Fenwick. "Ada old trunk in Hartmer box room. Blue shield cloak inside. Initials R.E. comb with care. Dunridge returned." Redfern wanted the trunk sent to York. Margaret refused. If Dunridge controls the household, it will vanish before noon. Mrs. Fenwick cannot carry it past him without being seen. Nathaniel folded the telegram. Then we return together. He expects that, yes, and he has already used the police, bribery, theft, and threats. Yes, Margaret buttered a piece of toast she had no appetite to eat. Then let him believe I am frightened enough to travel alone. The plan was hers, and it was simple. Redfern and Dr. Lane would take the morning express to York with copies of every document. Nathaniel would leave openly in the Duke's carriage. Margaret would remain at the hotel until noon, then travel under Mrs. Laneson's name by a stopping train and enter Hartmere through the village. No plan survives an enemy who has bribed the man selling the tickets. At a small station beyond Malton, the guard opened Margaret's compartment and told her a railway inspector wished to speak with her. The platform was empty except for two men in dark coats. The first seized her before her boots touched the ground. Margaret drove the brass edge of her reticule into his face. He cursed and released one arm, but the second man pressed a cloth over her mouth. The smell was sweet and medicinal. Chloroform, she thought, and remembered Dr. Lane complaining that careless surgeons used too much. She stopped struggling. The men mistook stillness for surrender. When the cloth shifted, Margaret turned her head and bit through the glove covering her mouth. The man shouted. She kicked the other behind the knee and ran 3 steps before a blow caught her at the base of the skull. The platform dropped into darkness. She woke to the smell of damp plaster. Her hands had been tied in front of her with curtain cord. She lay on a narrow bed beneath faded blue walls. Moonlight entered through boards nailed across the window, the blue room. Memory did not return like a picture. It returned through the body. Her lungs tightened before she saw the black stain above the door. Her shoulder burned before she noticed the iron nursery grate rusting in the corner. Somewhere in the walls, rain ticked through a broken gutter with the same rhythm as a lullaby Ada used to Humranmere Lodge. Margaret sat up. Her head throbbed. The room had been abandoned since the fire. Charred timber showed beneath later plaster, and dead leaves had gathered against the skirting. Voices sounded beyond the door. Lord Dunridge spoke first. She cannot appear before the trustees. You said she would take the pension. Cecily's voice trembled with fury. You said servants always take money. She is an Ellery. You spent 18 years telling me she was not. Margaret moved closer to the door. Lower your voice, Dunridge said. I saw Ada carry her across the orchard. Rosamund was alive. You told me Mr. Pike would stop them at the station, and you accepted that explanation because Roswick paid for your gowns, your horses, and every season in London. I was 11. You were 20 when you signed the first false declaration. You were 23 when you wrote that Lane's medical book must be found. Do not seek childhood now. It no longer fits you. Their steps moved away. Margaret pressed her bound hands against her mouth. The confession had been made to a ruined corridor, and a woman they meant never to release. It would carry little value unless she carried it out. She returned to the grate. The broken iron ornament still hung from one side, a hawthorn leaf with 3 sharp branches. She touched the shape, then the scar beneath her dress. A fragment returned. Ada wrapping her in a blue cloak, smoke along the ceiling, Cecily standing at the end of the passage, not crying, while a man poured oil from a lamp can. There had been another child in the house that night, the gamekeeper's daughter, sleeping in the nursery while her father worked. Margaret remembered Ada shouting for her. She remembered an empty bed. The burned remains had not been Rosamund's. They had belonged to a child whose name Lord Dunridge found more convenient to lose. Anger steadied Margaret more effectively than hope. She examined the curtain cord. It had been tied by men accustomed to securing luggage, not prisoners. The knot tightened when pulled from the ends, but a loop sat loose near her left thumb. Margaret had spent hundreds of evenings mending torn linen beneath poor light. Her fingers understood patient work. She freed one hand as a key turned in the door. Cecily entered carrying a lamp. For a moment, neither woman moved. Without the ballroom, pearls, and watching guests, Cecily looked smaller. She wore a dark traveling dress and no gloves. A scratch crossed one cheek, perhaps from forcing her way through the overgrown grounds. Her gaze settled upon the scar concealed beneath Margaret's collar. You should have taken the money. You should have told the truth. Truth would have made me the poor relation of a girl everyone preferred. I was 6. You were everything. Cecily set the lamp upon the mantel. Your mother was beautiful. Your father had Roswick. Even after they died, every servant spoke as if you were some precious relic. My father said the trust should have belonged to us. He said men built fortunes and foolish settlements handed them to little girls. So he burned a little girl. He meant to frighten Ada into surrendering you. The fire spread. And the gamekeeper's daughter? Cecily looked away. That movement answered. Margaret rose, keeping the loosened cord behind her skirt. What was her name? I do not know. Of course not. Her death made you rich, and you never learned her name. Cecily's face twisted. Do you believe becoming Lady Rosamund will make them love you? The ton will stare at your hands and hear a servant every time you open your mouth. Nathaniel may pity you, but a duke does not marry a housemaid. Then it is fortunate I did not cross England to find a husband. The bluntness of it stopped Cecily. Margaret pulled her right hand free and caught the lamp. Cecily lunged, perhaps fearing the flame near the old walls. Margaret did not throw it. She held it high and reached beneath the mantel. In memory, Ada's voice whispered through smoke, "Blue room. Hawthorne." Behind the song, a narrow wooden panel beside the fireplace had been painted to resemble the wall. Margaret pressed the carved hawthorn bud at its edge. The panel opened. Inside lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Cecily struck Margaret's arm. The lamp fell but landed upright upon the rug. They both reached for the packet. The oilcloth tore, spilling letters across the floor. One bore Cecily's handwriting. Father, I saw Ada take Rose from the east stair. The scar was bleeding through her nightdress. If they are found, you must not let anyone say I knew she lived. Cecily seized the letter. Margaret caught her wrist. Years of carrying coal, lifting water cans, and beating carpets had given the maid strength the Marquess's daughter did not possess. A servant's hands, Margaret said. You were right to notice them. She took the letter. Cecily slapped her. Margaret tasted blood, but her grip remained firm. The door opened again. Lord Dunridge stood on the threshold with a pistol. Give me the packet. Cecily backed away. Margaret looked at the old weapon. It was a small percussion pistol, the sort gentlemen carried more from vanity than usefulness. Dunridge's hand shook. At that distance, vanity could still kill. If you shoot me, Margaret said, the trustees will ask why. They will be told you fled. Dr. Lane has sworn his statement. Redfern holds Ada's affidavit. Pike confessed to the brooch. Paper burns, not every copy. His finger tightened. A pane shattered behind the boards covering the window. Nathaniel's arm came through the broken glass and tore one board loose. Dunridge turned toward the sound. Margaret threw the remaining curtain cord around his wrist and pulled with both hands. The pistol fired into the ceiling. Plaster rained across the room. Cecily screamed. Nathaniel forced himself through the window as Margaret twisted Dunridge's wrist until the pistol fell. The Duke kicked it beneath the bed. Dunridge struck him once across the mouth. Nathaniel answered with a single blow that sent the older man against the wall. Then he stopped. Rage moved through his body, but he held it where law could still distinguish justice from revenge. The constables are below, he said. Margaret stared at him. How did you find me? The station porter remembered a carriage with the Montfort crest filed from the door. One of the kidnappers was foolish enough to use Hartmere horses. Nathaniel touched the blood at the corner of his mouth. His eyes found the mark on Margaret's cheek. "Are you hurt?" "Not enough to stop." She gathered the letters from the floor. Below them, boots entered the ruined house. Dunridge looked at his daughter. "Say nothing." Cecily's gaze followed the pistol, the broken window, and the letter in Margaret's hand. "You promised she was dead," she whispered. The constables heard her. The settlement meeting began at Hartmere at noon on Thursday, despite Lord Dunridge's arrest. 3 trustees had travelled from London. Each was accustomed to fortunes becoming urgent when marriage approached. Redfern sat at one end of the long library table with Dr. Lane beside him. Nathaniel stood by the cold fireplace. He had ordered no refreshments beyond water. Cecily entered with a solicitor and her widowed aunt. She wore mourning gray, as though she were the injured party. Her face was composed, but her eyes moved constantly toward the door. Margaret waited in the anteroom with Mrs. Fenwick. The housekeeper had recovered Ada's trunk before Dunridge's servants could burn it. The blue child's cloak lay across Margaret's arms. Inside its collar, Helena Ellery had embroidered R.E. in silver thread. "You need not wear that," Mrs. Fenwick said. "I know." Margaret had refused the silk gown Nathaniel offered to purchase. She wore a plain dark blue dress bought in York with her own money. Its collar covered the scar. She would decide when it was seen. Through the door, the senior trustee asked Nathaniel whether he intended to execute the marriage settlement. "No," he answered. Cecily's solicitor began to object. Nathaniel spoke over him. "My engagement to Lady Cecily is ended." There was no evidence yet before the trustees. No declaration that Margaret was Rosamund. No restored fortune to save Hartmere. He had kept his promise. Cecily rose. "You would ruin your name for a servant's tale?" "No, I nearly ruined it by ignoring her. And when the bank takes this house, then I shall leave it without stealing another woman's home." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Fenwick opened the door. Every person at the table stood except Cecily. Redfern presented the evidence in careful order. The baptism entry established Rosamund Ellery's birth. Helena's miniature showed the family resemblance, but was offered only as supporting detail. Ada's sworn affidavit described the rescue and concealment. Pike's confession proved a recent attempt to frame Margaret. Dr. Lane identified the old fracture and the 7 suture marks. His published case drawing passed from hand to hand. Then Margaret placed the blue cloak upon the table. "This was worn by Lady Rosamund on the night of the fire." Cecily laughed. "A pair of initials and an old scar. Shall every red-haired maid in Yorkshire claim an estate?" "No," Margaret said. "Only the one you recognized." Cecily's laughter ended. Margaret unfastened her collar and drew the fabric aside. Candlelight touched the 3-pronged mark. No torn cloth exposed it now. No one held power over the moment. "You saw this scar in the Calderwick ballroom and called me Rosamund. Dr. Lane has testified that you were present when he stitched it. Will you deny both?" "I was startled." "By what?" "A resemblance." "To a dead child whose body could not be identified." Cecily looked toward her solicitor. Margaret laid the letter from the blue room beside the published drawing. Cecily's face changed before the trustee read a word. "That is private correspondence. It is an admission that you saw Ada carry me alive from Rowanmere, written by a frightened child." Redfern placed a second document beside it, and this declaration was signed by Lady Cecily at 20, affirming that she possessed no knowledge that Rosamund survived. The signatures were examined this morning by a London banking clerk accustomed to detecting forged drafts. They are the same. Cecily stood so quickly that her chair overturned. "My father made me sign it." Her solicitor caught her sleeve, but 18 years of fear had broken its banks. He said the fire had settled everything. He said the trustees cared only for seals and signatures. He said Ada would be silenced before she reached London. The words entered the quiet library one by one. The senior trustee removed his spectacles. "Lady Cecily, are you stating that Rosamund Ellery survived the fire?" Cecily looked at Margaret. Hatred remained. But beneath it lived the exhausted face of the 11-year-old girl who had once chosen comfort over a child running through smoke. "Yes. Is the woman before you that child?" Cecily's lips trembled. "Yes." The clock upon the mantel struck 1. For 18 years Margaret Bell had risen before dawn, polished other women's silver, carried other women's secrets, and answered to whatever name an employer chose to remember. The reversal came without trumpets. It came in the scratch of a trustee's pen. The senior trustee signed the preliminary acknowledgment. Pending confirmation by the court, the trustees recognize this claimant as Lady Rosamund Ellery, and suspend all payments to Lord Dunridge and his assigns. Cecily stared at the document. Rosewick's money would no longer buy her gowns. It would not secure her marriage. It would not pay the Duke's creditors or preserve the lie that had fed them all. Margaret refastened her collar. "You tore my dress because you believed a servant's dignity had no witnesses," she said. "The scar frightened you because it was the one witness you could not dismiss." Cecily's aunt led her from the room. No one bowed as she passed. Nathaniel remained by the fireplace. His future had just collapsed, and for the first time since Margaret had known him, his face was at peace. The trustees rose to offer her congratulations. She held up one hand. "Before you congratulate me, there is another child." She told them of the gamekeeper's daughter who had slept in the nursery. Redfern had already found the household wages book, naming the man who worked that night, Thomas Wren. His daughter Annie, aged 7, had disappeared after the fire. Her death had been folded into Rosamund's because a servant's child caused fewer legal complications than an heiress. Margaret's first act as the acknowledged beneficiary of the Ellery Trust was not to ask the value of Rosewick. It was to order a stone for Annie Wren's unmarked grave. Lord Dunridge was indicted for fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and the destruction of evidence. Pike's sworn confession and Cecily's letter supported the case. So did the testimony of one of the men hired at the station, who exchanged loyalty for a lesser sentence. The question of the fire itself could not be proved beyond doubt after 18 years, but the crimes committed to preserve its profit were enough. Cecily pleaded guilty to conspiracy and false declaration. Her title could not protect her from judgment, though it softened the place where she served 18 months. When she emerged, the society pages that had once praised her gowns gave her 3 lines. The Chancery Division moved with its traditional dislike of speed. It took 7 months to issue the final declaration that Margaret Bell and Lady Rosamund Ellery were one person in law. By then she no longer felt required to kill one name so the other could live. "Ada gave me Margaret," she told Redfern. "My mother gave me Rosamund. I will sign both." And so the documents read Rosamund Margaret Ellery. Rosewick Manor had been neglected, its cottages damp and its mills made profitable by wages that kept families hungry. Rosamund spent her first winter visiting each property with the steward. She entered kitchens, dye rooms, weaving sheds, and schoolhouses. Men who expected a sheltered lady found a woman who knew how much coal a corridor consumed, how long wet linen took to dry, and how employers hid hunger beneath the word economy. She raised the lowest wages first. She established a pension fund for domestic servants who had completed 10 years in a household. She converted Rowanmere Lodge into a convalescent home for girls injured in factory and domestic work. The blue nursery was pulled down, but its hawthorn grate was preserved as evidence until Dunridge's trial ended. Afterward, Rosamund had it melted and recast into the small bell above the home's entrance. It rang each morning at 8. Hartmere survived without the Montfort settlement. Nathaniel sold his London house. dismissed 2 costly agents, opened the estate accounts to his tenants, and reduced his own allowance before reducing a single servant's wage. Society called it eccentric. His creditors called it insufficient. By spring, better leases and the sale of unproductive land had given the estate room to breathe. He did not ask Rosamund for money. He wrote once each month. His letters contained no declarations. He reported the changes at Hartmere, asked practical questions about the servant pension, and sometimes enclosed a book he believed she would enjoy. She answered when she wished. In April, he came to Roswick by appointment. Rosamund received him in the estate office, where rain traced silver lines down the windows. No pearls announced her recovered rank. Ink stained one finger, and 3 sets of cottage plans covered the table. Nathaniel bowed. "Lady Rosamund." Miss Bell would also answer, "I know." He looked different without Hartmere's dark corridors behind him. Less like a portrait of authority, more like a man who had learned that dignity could survive the loss of display. "Mrs. Fenwick sent this," he said. He placed a parcel on the desk. Inside lay the gray dress Cecily had torn. The housekeeper had repaired the shoulder with stitches so fine that only a narrow line showed where the fabric had split. Rosamund touched the seam. "She believes useful things should not be discarded because someone powerful damaged them," Nathaniel said. "Mrs. Fenwick has never lacked opinions, nor accuracy." He walked with Rosamund through the grounds. At the convalescent home, 2 girls were planting lavender beneath the windows. Nathaniel listened as Rosamund explained the wages, medical costs, and training program. He did not praise her as though competence were surprising in a woman. He asked where the roof leaked and whether Hartmere's carpenter might repair it. At the end of the path, he stopped beneath a hawthorn tree beginning to flower. "I loved you before I knew your name," he said. Rosamund's hand tightened around the handle of her umbrella. "You did not know me well enough to love me. Then I admired you before I knew your name. I feared you a little after you told me the truth in the attic. I began to love you when you used your first moment of power to name Annie Wren." The rain softened around them. "I do not want gratitude," he continued. "I did not rescue you. I arrived at a window after you had freed your own hands and found the evidence yourself. That is an unusually honest proposal. It is not yet a proposal." Despite herself, she smiled. Nathaniel took one careful breath. "I am asking permission to court you, publicly, slowly, with every opportunity for you to send me away. And if I do, I shall go." Rosamund looked toward the girls, setting lavender in the wet earth. Once, she would have accepted safety because fear had trained her to be grateful for it. Nathaniel was not offering safety. He was offering choice. "You may call again next month," she said. He bowed, but the smile he tried to hide followed him all the way to his carriage. He called in May, June, and July. In August, Rosamund visited Hartmere and found that the south wing truly had been closed. Dust sheets covered the gilt furniture. The servants' hall, however, had new lamps and a stove that no longer smoked. In October, Nathaniel asked her to marry him beside the same ballroom doors through which she had once walked in disgrace. There were no guests, no musicians, and no witnesses except Mrs. Fenwick arranging flowers at the far end of the room. "I can promise that I will fail again," he said. "Pride is a weed with deep roots. But I can also promise that when you tell me I have failed, I will not send you below stairs to preserve my comfort." Rosamund studied him for a long moment. "My property remains mine, entirely. The settlement will protect the convalescent home and the pension fund. Redfern may make it unbreakable. I will retain my place as trustee. I would expect nothing else. And no woman in this house will ever be dismissed without being heard." Nathaniel glanced toward Mrs. Fenwick. "I suspect that rule has already been entered into Hartmere law." Rosamund laughed. It was the sound that gave him his answer. They married the following February in the village church. Rosamund wore no high collar. The silk curved below her right shoulder, leaving the 3 white branches visible in the winter light. Some guests stared because society had not improved as quickly as one duke had. Rosamund let them look. Nathaniel did not place his hand over the scar or pretend it was not there. He offered his arm and waited for her to choose it. She did. Outside, the bell cast from the broken nursery grate rang across the frost, and Rosamund Margaret Ellery walked into her new life carrying both of her names. Thank you for staying with Rosamund through this complete story of stolen identity, quiet courage, and a dignity no title could create or erase. If her journey from a humiliated maid to a woman who reclaimed her name moved you, please give this video a like. It helps the algorithm carry more historical romance stories to viewers who love them. Share it with a fellow fan of dukes, great houses, betrayal, and hard-won love. Subscribe to Secrets of Belgrave and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next full story. And tell me in the comments, should Rosamund have forgiven Nathaniel, or should she have chosen a life without him?